The dramatic expansion of the Mongols that began under Temujin was the most important event in world history in the 13th century. The son of a minor Mongol chief, Temujin's brilliant leadership in intertribal warfare enabled him to unify the Mongol peoples in a ruthless 2-year campaign. To mark his success, he was proclaimed Gengis, Universal, Khan in 1206. During his unification campaign, he created what has often been called the finest cavalry army that the world has ever seen. If the army was not to break up, and his kingdom with it, he had to find work for it to do and wealth with which to reward it. He therefore adopted a policy of all-round aggression, and by his death in 1227 he had conquered an empire that included most of Central Asia and northern China. His successors, his son Agedai and grandsons Kuyuk and Monkey, continued his expansionist policy, and by 1259 they had carried the Mongol conquests into Europe and the Middle East. In China only the southern Song Empire stood out against the Mongols, though it too would fall within 20 years. However, Mongol unity was fragile, and already the achievement of Gengis Khan had started to unravel. The Mongol conquests formed the largest land empire in history. The achievement is all the more remarkable in that the Mongols had few governmental institutions and did not even possess basic metalworking skills. They were fortunate in being able to exploit existing disunity among their enemies. China was divided into 3 hostile kingdoms. The powerful Turkish empires of Kara, Khitai and Khwarezm were mutually hostile and had dynastic problems, and Russia, like most of Europe, was a mosaic of quarrelsome states which cooperated only reluctantly and ineffectually against the common enemy. The key factor in the Mongol success, however, was the magnificent army that Gengis created. Unlike the armies of their opponents, where birth usually determined rank, promotion in the Mongol army was by merit only. The discipline and mobility of the Mongol army enabled it to execute complex battlefield maneuvers, giving it decisive advantages over any opponent. A frequent tactic was the feigned retreat, used to lure rash pursuers into ambushes on unfavorable ground where they could be destroyed. The Mongols had an excellent long-range weapon in the composite bow, which enabled them to inflict casualties while keeping out of danger themselves. The Mongols also committed horrific atrocities, systematically creating terror to sap their enemies' will to resist. This persuaded many Turks, Uyghurs, Kipchaks and Chinese to defect to the Mongols rather than risk defeat. The Mongol military machine had its limitations. Except in China, the boundaries of the Mongol Empire were very close to those of the Eurasian steppes and grasslands, which alone the necessary grazing for the vast herds of horses that accompanied every Mongol army. The defeat suffered by the Mongols at the hands of the Mamluks at Anjaliat in 1260 was to some extent the result of poor grazing in the Syrian desert. This, rather than the strength of local resistance, was probably also the reason why the Mongols never returned to Europe after their invasion of 1241–42. The army also needed plenty of room for maneuver, so it was less effective in forested, mountainous or intensively farmed areas than in open country. This helps to explain, for example, the relative slowness of the conquest of China. The period of the Mongols' expansion had few beneficial results. They destroyed far more than they built. the most sophisticated civilizations of the time, the Muslim and the Chinese, suffered the worst. The Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad, spiritual, cultural and, for much of the time, political leader of the Muslim world since the 8th century, was overthrown. The ancient cities of Central Asia were devastated and never recovered their former prosperity. Depopulation and the neglect of irrigation channels meant that most of Iraq and West Persia was reduced to desert for centuries. Northern China suffered. Depopulation and the Mongol conquest isolated Russia from the mainstream of European development for almost 2 centuries. The impact of the Mongols on the rest of Christendom was fleeting, and by disrupting the Muslim world they granted a brief stay of execution to the Crusader states and allowed a short-lived revival of the crumbling Byzantine Empire. Eventually, Christendom benefited from the Mongol conquests in Asia, as Muslim control of the Silk Route ended and the way was opened for Westerners such as Marco Polo to travel to East Asia for the first time.